Thank you very much for the Foundation for inviting me to present today. I am a medical officer, urologist by trade, and the Clinical Deputy Division Director for the Division of Reproductive, Gastrorenal, and Urologic Devices in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the Food and Drug Administration. So a lot of acronyms there. And I think I'd like to start by saying, you know, I have no disclosures. As any federal agency, we have to be given our authority to regulate by Congress through statutes or laws. That stands for the FAA, the FTC. Any of these federal agencies have to be given permission or authority to regulate something. And without statutory authority, the FDA actually has no jurisdiction. So we have to go by the laws that we're given and the authorities that's provided to us by Congress. And as a baby boomer, by the way, I never thought I'd be using Schoolhouse Rock graphics in one of my presentations, but so be it. That's how things work out sometimes. So the relevant statute for physician training and credentialing for medical devices comes from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. 80 years ago this was written, in 1938. And basically it says that the Secretary or the FDA can restrict the sale, distribution, or use of a device if, because of its potentiality for harmful effect or the collateral measures necessary for its use, the Secretary determines that there cannot otherwise be reasonable assurance of its safety and effectiveness. And that's the bar, is reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for medical devices. And when it comes to training, what that actually means, that no condition may restrict the use of a device to persons with specific training or experience in its use or to persons for use in certain facilities unless the Secretary determines that such a restriction is required for the safe and effective use of the device. Basically what this says is, if training and credentialing is necessary for the safe and effective use of the device, then the FDA has jurisdiction and authority to regulate that training. After that, there's really no further clarification statutorily as to what that training is or how the training should be conducted or what it must include. And there's actually a pretty good reason for that. When you start talking about physician training and credentialing, it starts to sound very much like the practice of medicine. And that's certainly outside the purview of the FDA. We don't regulate the practice of medicine. And so we walk a bit of a fine line in ensuring the safety and effectiveness of a device through various means, but one of them being training and credentialing, but not going over the line and getting into what could be considered the practice of medicine when it comes to training physicians and how physicians should be trained. So this is a good and bad thing. There's not a lot of clarity as to how to move forward with this issue, but it ensures that we're not overzealous on the FDA's part. Training and credentialing can be a condition of approval for a PMA or Class 3 device. These are our highest risk devices. A condition of approval means if you want this device approved, this has to be accomplished. And we'll give you an example a little bit later of a special control, which is for a de novo device, which is the device that Mark Carroll mentioned earlier, the HIFU devices for prostate ablation, or Class 2 in moderate risk devices. And a special control is a list of things that any device in that class that comes after it, or the first device in any that comes after it, had to meet to get onto the market. So these are the special controls for the HIFU devices, and I know you can't read that, so I brought it up. This is an example of what special controls would be for training for the high-intensity ultrasound devices for prostate ablation. Training must be provided so that upon completion of the training program, the physician can, A, use all safety features of the device, B, accurately target the high-intensity ultrasound energy within the desired region of the prostate, and perform the ablation procedure that minimizes damage to non-target tissues. It's pretty vague and generic, and that's somewhat by design. How does this actually work? Typically, the FDA proposes, the sponsor, the manufacturer, proposes a training protocol that is then reviewed by the FDA, and the sponsor and the FDA work interactively until a satisfactory program can be agreed upon that meets the requirements of the act that I mentioned earlier, the statute that I mentioned earlier, the reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. How this really works is, and I think we heard a little bit earlier today, through our pre-submission process. The pre-submission process, again, is simply a question and answer opportunity for sponsors to come to the FDA, provide some information to the FDA, and have the FDA comment on it without anything significant weighing in the balance. We don't make an approval or disapproval recommendation on a clinical trial or a market application during pre-submission. And there's a guidance out there, which I think was referred to as how the pre-submission process works. And this is an excellent opportunity where sponsors can bring anything before the FDA and get the FDA's take on it. And training and credentialing can certainly, a training and credentialing protocol could certainly fit under something that we would comment on in a pre-submission process. In addition, the device labeling must reference the need for training if the training is required for the safety and effectiveness of the device. And furthermore, post-market studies can be used to assess the adequacy of training programs. It's not often, but sometimes it does happen. So with that said, and it's pretty obvious that it's pretty vague as to what the FDA is looking for or the regulatory authority that's given, it's really up to the sponsor, the manufacturer, to kind of develop their training and credentialing. I think, number one, we all agree that they know their devices best. Number two, it's in their best interest to have their devices used appropriately and safely and effectively. So I think at this point, what I'm most interested in is to throw it back to the panel and to see how they think about training and credentialing from the sponsor perspective. Thank you. And I think Mark is up next, if I remember correctly.
Thank you for that information, Mark.